All right, let's begin. Bienvenue à tous et à toutes. Welcome everyone to the 5th annual lecture of the Jan P. Lynn Center for the Study of Freedom and Global Orders in the Ancient and Modern Worlds. I'm Jacob Levy, the founding director of the center and Tomlinson Professor of Political Theory here at McGill. The Lynn Center is McGill's home for humanistic social inquiry, combining normative, historical, comparative, and spatial methods of the analysis of social orders. It is foundationally committed to integrating the study of the ancient and modern worlds, the study of the many regions of the world in both specific and global analyses, and to integrating the study of the liberal arts with the study of the sciences and engineering. That last commitment makes today's speaker particularly exciting for us, as I'll return to in a moment. The center was established by a generous gift to McGill from Dr. Jan P. Lynn, McGill PhD in Engineering, class of 1992. And as always, we are tremendously grateful to Dr. Lynn for his support of the center and of McGill. This month marks the beginning of McGill University's bicentennial celebration, and today's lecture is a part of that. We gratefully acknowledge support for the event from the Faculty of Arts Bicentennial Fund. Under other circumstances, this would have been one of the first major academic events on campus in the bicentennial calendar, and we would have had appropriate festivities in honor both of 200 years of the Royal Institution for the Advancement of Learning and in honor of our very distinguished guest. As it is, we've of course lost the opportunity for in-person festivities, but gained, I think, an intellectual prompt for the topic of today's lecture, which goes some long way toward making up for the lost opportunity. McGill University is situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. We recognize and respect the Kanien'kehá:ka as the traditional custodians of the land and waters on which we virtually meet today. Our lecture today will be given by Professor Bruno Latour. Bruno Latour is very simply one of the world's leading social theorists and social scientists of the ways in which humans and human societies interact with, depend upon, and shape science and technology. He's been on the faculty of the École des Mines in Paris and at Sciences Po Paris, where he's also served as vice president for research. And he has served also as centennial professor at the London School of Economics. His many awards and honors include the Holberg Prize. He's written and edited more than 20 books, published more than 150 articles, and engaged in a variety of kinds of scholarship and public communication in a variety of media, from photographic essays to curated museum exhibitions, in addition to his many monographs, scholarly contributions, and contributions to public debate. He will be speaking with us today on a change in cosmology. And he is, of course, speaking to us in light of the circumstances directly from Paris, where it is very much later at night, and we are very grateful to him for that added part of his sacrifice and work in being with us here today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bruno Latour.
Thank you very much. I'm going to use this system at a great distance, and I hope it will work. Yes, it seemed to work. No, it actually does not work yet. Okay. This system of Zoom is, of course, slightly tiring. We all know about it. And it had one great inconvenience, which is that people, after having been deprived of so many contact and social ties for so long, might end up into very strange ideas. And unfortunately, I'm afraid this is the sort of thing that you are going to hear from me, but it will be probably something which you would be charitable enough to give it's due to the COVID lockdown, in which we have been in France almost for now a year, with a few months off. And it is actually about lockdown that I'm going to talk about, because strangely enough, I want to try to lead the conversation before the discussion time from one lockdown, which is the pandemic one, to another one, which is I call the cosmological one, and draw out of it a few political consequences. So this is what I'm going to do with you tonight. But before, I'd like to celebrate in memoriam, so to speak, the death 2 days ago of our good friend, the master of anthropology, Marshall Sanin, here with my good friend Eduardo Vivero de Castro a few years ago in Chicago in his office. And it's a great sadness for all of us, even though he was 90. And all the anthropologists know how much we miss not only his scholarship, which was amazing, but also his fierce tongue, so to speak, and his laughing matter and generosity. We have all been indebted to Marshall, and especially for one reason, which might be visible at the end of his lecture, which is his work, very early work, on the economy, and this doubt about the economy as a frame of mind, a universal frame of mind that he introduced very early on in his career. So let's remind all of us how much we owe to Marshall. The reason why I'm interested in this double set of lockdown is because of an anthropological puzzle, which is not without any link with Marshall work, actually, which is that it's a triple anthropological puzzle, which is happening just at the same time. One of them is, where are we confined? That is the realization that we might not know exactly anymore where we stand, so to speak, in a very literal sense, as you will see. Which period of time we are living in. I all know that we have never been modern, but that's not very helpful right now. When are we, so to speak? And even more troubling is what sort of human agency are we supposed to be? I leave aside the usual discussion on the we. The we here is the one who have been modern. That is an undefined set of people who are worried about this anthropological puzzle, who suddenly realize that there is a triple question: where, when, and basically who, and on what sort of agency we are supposed to act. A very practical way of showing you the strange things which the lockdown is introducing in our discussion is that I was just a year ago opening an exhibition in ZKM in Germany, in Karlsruhe, called Critical Zone. And the critical zone was a way to learn precisely about the place, the site, the location in which we developed, and some of the scientists I was introducing in this exhibition are developing a science of a confined space, so to speak, which they call critical zone. It's not my word, it's their word. I read what is on the cover of the MIT catalog, which gives you an idea of what we wanted to do in this exhibition. You want me to land on Earth. Why? Well, because you are hanging in mid-air, headed for a crash. How is it down there? Pretty tense. A war zone, close, a critical zone, a few kilometers thick where everything happened. Is it habitable? Well, depends on your chosen science. Will I survive down there? Well, depends on your politics. And this is why the book of MIT, which is accompanying this exhibition, was called The Science and Politics of Landing on Earth. It's a strange idea that we have to land on Earth. Does it mean that we were not there before? Well, in a way, this is what I'm going to argue, that we were in mid-air. We were suspended, we, the former modern. But what is very strange is that what happened is that the exhibition was never opened because it was actually mothball, how do you say that? It was, we were preparing the exhibition, as you see in this image, with a fabulous group of ZKM, with Peter Weibel, that you see here, which is the big boss of this amazing place. And we were ready to open the show and preparing all its detail. But then it was mothballed because of a lockdown. So you see the exhibition, but actually I haven't never seen it. I was there just for a day, and it was closed. It's still there, might open, but nobody has been able, almost nobody has been able to go there physically. So we go there, I mean, like we do here through Zoom. And we even had to do an opening, a virtual opening, as you see in the bottom. And I found that this anecdote quite illuminating, that in order to say and to show in an exhibition where we do reside, it's actually the place where we cannot be because we are locked down. So the lockdown is actually a sort of exaggeration of a situation we wanted to portray in this great exhibition. Fortunately, we have the catalog, but this is not sufficient when, as I learned doing exhibition, the space in which you can actually show to visitors where they are located is actually crucial. I mean, the physical proximity with the works of art is essential. We all know that. I just repeat something we are suffering from every day, especially in Paris, where all of the works, all of the places where we could see art is actually closed. So the argument that we wanted to make in this mothball exhibition was a surprise, a cosmological surprise, which is that the globe is not actually a very good way of approaching the question of where we are. And it was very surprising to me to work with those critical zone observatories scientists whom I've been gathering in this exhibition and studied for now a few years, that the place which is the most heterogeneous place that they actually study and for which we don't know that much, this is why the science of critical zone is developing so much, is actually badly visible when you consider it as the biofilm or the surface of the membrane, if you want, of a globe. So we did a very interesting experiment with a student of Albena Yaneva from Manchester called Alexandra Aren, with an architect and an artist in her own way. And we proposed her to find a way to shift the representation of a globe, which as a consequence renders invisible the critical zone because it's so thin compared to the expand and extent of the geological Earth, and to make it visible not only to the scientists of a critical zone, but to the public. And this is one of the effects we wanted to put in the show. I mean, we are not in a globe seeing the Earth from the outside, even though this view is very famous and is also very beautiful, but it's not actually the view because no one sees the Earth from this place except for a few astronauts or a few satellites. We are inside this critical zone, this very thin, tiny little thing. We are locked in this very small biofilm, and we have difficulty representing it. So we became interested in trying to understand how thin it is. And basically, it's a few meters, a few kilometers thin. It's immensely heterogeneous compared to the upper and lower boundaries, as far as we know. And it's also the only place where living forms have experienced the transformation of their early condition, which is, of course, as you know, the Gaia argument. Living forms have transformed a planet which was not especially good for life, but they made it good for life in the billions of years they have been working at it. But only on this very, very small, a few kilometers thick film, so to speak. And not, so it's a problem of representation, of cosmological representation. And that's what I mean by the second lockdown. Where are we in this very small situation, which is always ignored when you are taking a globe and you look at it from the outside? And even though the blue planet is a very moving image, it doesn't give you a feel of what it is to be inside. And what is interesting in this critical zone observatory scientists is a new attention to the soil, because basically among these few hundred meters, a few kilometers up and down, the soil is the most heterogeneous, the most complex, in very many ways, the least understood part, and yet the only place where all the living entities are actually gathered and have experienced their connection with one another. So there is a great interest in the soil as a frontier of science. And you know, of course, all the discussions and controversies and war about the destruction of those soil, which takes a few days or a few bulldozers to disappear and thousands of years to be reconstructed. So the new attention to the soil is absolutely typical of its interest in being inside the critical zone. We are confined in a place where the soil itself, in all its complexity and in all its fragility, is actually essential for life. We know that, of course. I mean, it has been known by ecologists, agronomists, pedologists, soil scientists. But the difference is in trying to locate the situation where we can no longer ignore the importance of the soil. This is the difference between critical zone science and the usual view of agronomy, if you want, or hydrology, separated disciplines studying the same situation. It's an interest in the way the Earth is actually constituted. And I was very surprised and delighted, and this is a small sharing of books, which I'd like to do with you, because it's such a beautiful book by Veronica de Landora, The Mantle of the Earth, Genealogies of a Geographical Metaphor, which is actually a very long study of the veils, garments, covers, mantles, all sorts of tissues and networks and tying and stitching, which have been in the history of a Western imagination and at the heart of geography since the Greek all the way to the Gaia hypothesis. And it's very interesting because it's a study about the feeling of the Earth, the feeling of the materiality of the Earth. And it's basically the sort of thing I'm interested cosmologically, because she shifts the interest of geography from sort of hard rocks to veils. And the whole history of veil is actually very long. And it's a beautiful book of scholarship. It goes in all sorts of places. It has a long description of the famous Epstein Napa Mundi, where, as you see it, Christ, the body of Christ, with the head of Christ, the fingers of Christ and the legs of Christ, are actually integrated, incarnated in the whole history and geography of the Earth as it was known in the 13th century. So it's simultaneously a geography, a history, She says it's also a host. It has the shape of a host, and it's the body of Christ, the incarnation, so to speak, of the veiled earth, which is this is a detail from the Epfort Napa with the head of Christ, and you see the beginning of a story of the Garden of Eden. And she goes on. She starts with the Greek, the whole metaphors of mantle, of veil, the whole argument about nature being veiled, of course, and it goes even in the 16th century interest in the fact that even when you begin this very famous geographical, one of the first, let's say, modern cartography, it is nevertheless, as you see here, included into a very rich set of metaphors and images about veil and about moving veil, opening the veil, or on the contrary, veiling the veil. And it gives to the materiality of the earth this sort of mantle or networky or tissue-like that she pursues and pursues even a century later, all the way to the 21st century, as if the materiality of the earth was better captured, so to speak, by the image of biofilm, the image of a veil, with, of course, the dialectic between veiling and unveiling, which he pursues in the whole history of science, as well as the history of theology. I'm telling you this not only because it's a fabulous book, but also because it fits very well with what we were interested in doing in Critical Zone. I immediately sent her the book, Critical Zone, to see what she was doing with it. And there's a lot of interesting aspect, which is a different feel for the materiality of what it is to be on Earth, which I think is the great advantage of this book and the great interest of Critical Zone. And it extends, of course, to the science of Critical Zone, especially with the great interest among recent science for biofilms. That is the very existence of biofilm and the amazing numbers of sites on this critical zone, which are actually constituted by biofilm, which form a sort of intermediary stage between individual bacteria and multi-cellular organism. And there's a whole development of the science of biofilm, which of course fit with lots of interesting aspects of a critical zone and the Gaia hypothesis. So this was not a parenthesis, it's actually a way to enter into the fabric, in the literal sense, the fabric of the Earth's superficial aspect. But what we try with Alexandra Arène is something which is more directly related to the cosmological question, which is a shift in how we represent the place inside which we are confined. We are confined inside this very small place, which we have difficulty representing when we take it as the surface of a globe, because once again, viewed from a global view, the part in which the critical zone is actually made by life form disappear from view. It's so thin that it has no thickness, so to speak. So we wanted to give depth to the surface in a paper that we wrote together with a geochemist, Gaillardet, Alexandra, with an architect, and I don't know, sort of philosophers, and a lockdown philosopher. And the argument is very interesting because it's a way to take the principle of a globe, to peel it, so to speak, and to flip it like a globe, as you can see here, so that inside the traditional view, which is here, which is a globe, with the inside, the core, and then the very superficial critical zone, which is invisible. And then Alexandra decided to do exactly the opposite, that is to shift it so that what is outside here is the deep earth. And what is inside is the atmosphere. And that's exactly the representation of being locked down and confined on Earth. The Earth is actually, the atmosphere is actually here in the middle. And then, of course, when you move, you can go to the hard rock and to the mantle now in the modern sense in geology. But the great thing is that then the superficial aspect, the superficial biofilm, which was invisible in this version, become visible in that one. And that's a very interesting, not only because it's interesting to see an architect collaborating with a geochemist, but it's also a way of representing where we are. Because if you are here, you are facing an infinite universe inside the globe, which you are supposed to see from the outside, but you never see it from the outside, except through astronaut photography. But here is the place where we reside. We are inside the lockdown, and the importance, interest, and thickness of the superficial few centimeters, which were invisible in this version, become as thick as you wish to be here. And that, I think, is an interesting question, which resembles in many ways the sort of question which had to be solved, so to speak, in earlier period. Sorry, I have to try to activate the, this is a little film which I will pass briefly. So this is the globe view, we are used to it. This is a question about the puzzle of the smallness of the biofilm on which we reside, and we have difficulty representing. And of course, the whole question is try to render visible, interesting, the thickness, the now thick critical zone with everything which is supposed to be studied by all these disciplines which are called critical zone science. That is, give depth to the surface. We live in the surface, but we want depth in it. And we want to be able to have enough space, literally, to bring in all these other aspects which are so important for the understanding. So this is the flipping of the globe. And now the Earth, the globe, the Earth core is reversed, so to speak. The Earth core is now outside and the critical zone is inside. So that's the globe operation. And what is interesting is, again, that you see here, that the notion of the Earth core has shifted its position, so to speak. The Earth core, the thing that is important, the thing that is interesting, the thing we owe our life, is now visible instead of being superficial. And the feeling of being locked in is much more strong if the atmosphere is actually inside. And it goes very far, because in a very interesting book called Terraforming, which was published by MIT soon in English, the authors, Frédéric Aïtouati, Alexandra Rennes, and Axel, went to try to study and multiply the example to render the thickness of a critical zone visible. And the consequence of that, which we now work with an interesting, I pass a few of the things which we are now working with a few scientists at the Institut du Globe in Paris, is that you see, I will just go for the carbon cycle, that the interest, oops, I'm sorry. This is complicated to do such a subtle with the zoom when you're an old man like me. So what is interesting is that you can also now begin to activate in this view the cycling aspect of the geochemistry of a critical zone. And many of the critical zone scientists are actually geochemists. And it's very difficult to represent not only the surface of the Earth, but the cycling of the chemical which define its dynamism, so to speak. And this is what we have been trying with Alexandra and the scientists, the geochemists, and Institut de Physique du Globe, because it's a very crucial understanding, again, of layers, like the mantle of the Earth I was talking before, and also about the cycling aspect of it. And it seemed to me that the ability to view this cycle is essential for precisely the feel, so to speak, of the materiality of the Earth. Basically, the cosmological crisis we are in it is that there is a sort of misunderstanding of what the Earth is made of. If it's a globe, it has a sort of consistency. If it's a critical zone, it has another one. And of course, it's Gaia, it's still another one. So this is the sort of work we are trying to develop in order to understand in which way we can modify the cosmological view. Because of course, as every anthropologist knows, once you have a cosmology, you also have lots of other things in place, including what sort of subject and what sort of politics is associated with it. So my argument, as you know, maybe if you have read some of my stuff, is that there is a politics if you are on Earth as a globe, and there is another politic if we are in the critical zone, and that's the sort of thing. So it provides, if you wish, a different relation to space, to the movement, to the cycle. And Alexandra, in the paper in the critical zone book, tried to picture the sort of energy of this cycling critical zone, which is not the Earth. I mean, it turns, it's cycle, it's a turning and moving Earth, but it doesn't move in the same way. And here you have only one part of it, which is the part which is activated by the sun. Again, the atmosphere in the middle and the continental crust at the outside, and all of the transformation which goes from rocks to life forms. And this is, of course, also a way to picture some of the aspects of the Gaia hypothesis, which is not just about living form, but about the way we have transformed the rocks, the mineral, the water, the whole cycle, which have been sort of borrowed, transported, transformed, hijacked, if you want, by living forms to transform their own condition of existence. So this is, of course, what is behind this scenography or cosmology, no matter what you want to call it. And of course, now you would have to add probably other things. You would have to add the newly discovered masses of bacteria and life forms which are not activated by the sun, the part which is actually below the continental subsurface and the deep oceanic subsurface, which, as you know, in this incredible recent paper by Hans-Gert Fleming and Stefan Wirth, is actually, this is the massive presence of life form which has actually ignored the sun aspect, the sun activated aspect, and which are depending on other ways of surviving at deep subsurface, which is quite extraordinary. And there is a long paper in Nature about it recently. So this is the sort of thing. It's also to show how much we ignore about the dynamic. It's not only that we have difficulty representing it, but we have difficulty knowing how many agents and how many phenomena are actually activating this superficial Earth. So there are a few consequences which I've been very interested in developing, and I've been developing it in Facing Gaia, and also in theater, in the exhibition, which is now an invisible exhibition about where we live, critical zone. And also because it is a cosmological distinction, a cosmological shift, which sort of bring, I'm not going to get into that because I've already done many times this argument about Gaia, but still there is an interesting shift between the Galilean planet, so to speak, the one we see from the outside, which turns around in the infinite universe, the one we are used to, so to speak, in the sort of imaginary of a scientific revolution, and the other one, which is the moving Earth, but it moves on itself, the moving Earth of Gaia, the moving Earth of critical zone, the moving Earth that we have just seen in this simulation by Alexandra, which is moving in a very different way, because of course it has consequences on the way it is inhabited by life form, which was not the case of a Galilean cosmos. So I don't know how much we can do on that. I don't know. It will require a lot of a fine history of science to be done, but it's interesting to do the comparison because it gives us the scale of a cosmological transformation which is happening now, and that we call, with an somewhat euphemism, ecological mutation or climate change or global warming, which is actually a shift in cosmology which has the same size, the same importance as the shift from the so-called pre-Copernican world to Galileo. So it's a sort of second moving Earth inside the first moving Earth. And I've been doing quite a lot of experiment on this shift and what it does to live in one world or in the other. But I'm interested in something else because I followed the Gaia Galileo, sort of Lovelock Galileo parallel, so to speak, Lovelock Margulis on one hand and Galileo in the other, in many instances. But there is one series of consequences of this shift which I want to develop with you. One of them is, of course, the scale of human intervention. And I'm sure you have seen these papers recently, but they are so striking, which I wanted to comment them with you. They are by the same group, Milos and others, which compare two incredible questions summarized in an even more incredibly simple metric, which is weight. This is the weight of plant, protists, bacteria, archaea. Then there is a small place here for animals, okay? So that's developed here among the animals, the arthropods, actually fairly big, mollusk, nematode, and here are the humans. And here the humans are taken as, I'm sorry for us, but it's just as weight, 0.06 gigaton. Okay. The same group, so this was a paper from 2 years ago. The same group published last year this paper, which I'm sure some of you have seen, which is about this time comparing the weight, again weight, the weight of a biomass to the weight, what they call the anthropogenic mass, which actually is the sort of the technosphere, if you want, what the amount of stuff humans, not all humans, of course, very small numbers of humans, but is the modern humans, of a few modern humans, of a few very, very small numbers of industrial societies have produced. And you see that since 2010, the weight of the technosphere is actually equal and even superior now for the last 10 years to a biomass. So the totality of the biomass that you saw in these images, which is with the humans are so small, are actually the weight of a technosphere by these small numbers of these small, very small animals is actually equivalent to the biomass. So this is just, I mean, of course, calculation is very difficult. The legend of this paper is actually, I think, 30 pages long in order to show all the approximation in the calculation. But they give an idea, and precisely they give a scale. And that's, again, why I'm interested in this notion of lockdown. If you are in the globe, thrown in the infinite universe, the human is nothing, but it can do nothing, but it cannot do much either. It's just lost in space. When you have a human locked down inside the critical zone, and a modern human and a few industrial humans doing this sort of thing, which is developing their industry, then it's completely different. The space, the mass of stuff, and the physical occupation of a critical zone becomes much more visible. So this is why I'm so interested in this question of scale, which define a sort of attitude toward the lockdown, which is very different from the one we had before when we are thrown into the infinite universe or in nature. So do you understand now the title of this little meditation? I think it's more a meditation than a lecture, actually, which is that we are sort of locked down because of a pandemic. We are learning from the virus every day that we live in the world of virus. We are the one who are calling the shot, so to speak. We are now mutating. They do their job of virus. So we are in their world. And we try nonetheless to get out of our home, out of the lockdown, vaccination, etc. You all know that. We all suffer from news every day on this question. But there is another lockdown, which is the one where we will enter, so to speak, when we get out of the pandemic lockdown, which is the cosmological one. That is the fact of being inside this space, which is not very well known, but which is the only one living form of the experience. Oh, this is a subject of a little book which I published this year, and which is which title, which is the link with this lecture. Where are we? I mean, where am I? If I am in nature, I mean, it's not the same place as if I'm in the critical zone. If I'm locked down, it's not the same atmosphere, it's not the same drive, it's not the same progress, it's not the same project as if I am in the universe, the cosmological of universe of, let's say, the century before us. And of course, that's where things become more political, if you want, because the shift in space, this sort of disagreement or disorientation of where we are, has an enormous consequence, which, in my view, account for the brutalization of politics which we observe everywhere, which is that the gap, which has been studied by environmental historians, post-colonial studies, feminist studies for many years, is actually now visible in the cruel and crucial way when you consider that the world which we live in, Canadian, French, American, and the world we live from does not match. That is the gap, the cantilever, if you want to use the expression of this very important book by Pierre Charbonnier called Abundance and Liberty, which will be published soon by Polity Press. This dismantling, so to speak, of the world we live in and the world we live from account for the process of decivilization in which we are unfortunately now thrown in. Inside the modernist time space, there was a sort of illusion largely, but it was shared illusion that there was a process of civilization moving on, so to speak. And now that you have to relocate the whole question of abundance and freedom inside the lockdown space of a critical zone, then suddenly all of the disputes about where we live from, the world we live from and the world we live in, is actually exacerbated. Because now, and that's of course the great surprise of the ecological politics, is that the question of ecology is not, as I've shown many times, is not a way to pacify politics, but on the contrary, to intensify the connection, because now we are engaged for every single bit of this critical zone into the question of fight, literally fight for space, or more exactly, fight for the possibility of maintaining the habitability condition of this space. So the question of, in the beautiful book, which is not a book about ecology, it's about the fact that political ideas from the beginning of liberalism all the way to the end of the 20th century were actually also about space, about materiality, about cosmology, but in a sort of distorted way, because it didn't actually reflexively always activate the limits of the Earth, so to speak. So politics has always been about what I call the geosocial question, but it was not explicitly so, and now it is explicitly so, and it's war, because now we have this amazing situation where we have to bring the whole question of abundance and modernism, so to speak, inside the lockdown space that we are learning. And we are learning twice. We are learning from the virus. The situation will never be exactly the same, but we are also learning it from this science of a critical zone I'm talking about. And that's also the other point, is that we are disoriented in time. I know we have been disoriented in time since the beginning of the idea of the modern, but there is a sort of intensification of this disorientation in time. And this is a paper we wrote with Dipesh Chakrabarty, and now he has a new book on the question, which is that the conflicts now about where to go in time are actually much more difficult because we don't share the definition of the globe where we are situated. And this is what we try to argue. I'm not going to get again into all this question of multiple planets, but it is a conflict of planetary proportion. It's a conflict about which sort of planet we live in. And of course, the fact that there is no unity of a planet, because the way we see it, the way we study it, the way we think it's going, the way we imagine that it has space, the way we imagine that it is situated in time differs from one version of the planetary, so to speak, as to use the expression that Dipesh introduced, in addition to all the other disputes, which were the classical controversies and struggles, so to speak, on the social sphere. So we disagree, as we always did, on ideology. We disagree on what it is to be religious. We disagree about values, etc. But we also disagree on which planet we inhabit. And that's at the heart of the ecological crisis. And that explains, in my view, a large part of the brutalization of politics. Because if you have people who want to exit and are preparing their exit to Mars, to take one example, at the same time, when you have people who are entering the Anthropocene and others who are trying to get into, as Dipesh argued, into the emancipation, another one who go to the terrestrial, there is no, it is not just a dispute about opinion, it's not a dispute about value, it's not a dispute about social classes, it's about the cosmology. And the intensity of the war is, of course, depending on these discrepancies. And I want to add, to talk about one small example about this disorientation in time, because I was very interested in a striking Guardian paper by Andrew Bacevich last year about the Cold War. Because, of course, the big problem is why were we not prepared for landing on Earth? Why were we not prepared for the ecological mutation, which has been studied and has been visible for 50 years, at least? I mean, 50 years in terms of, let's say, certainty about, consensus, if you want. And Bacevich, in this argument about the 1899, the winning the Cold War, is, I think, extremely interesting. Let me read the quote. Winning the Cold War brought American, I cannot read here because it is face to face with a predicament comparable to that confronting the lucky person who wins the lottery. Hidden within a windfall is the potential for monumental disaster. The way it ended, with euphoric young Germans dancing on the wall, imparted to the entire Cold War, I love this fact, a retrospective moral clarity that it did not deserve. In other words, winning the Cold War meant that people believed that they actually won against communism when they were losing on the side of the ecological question. And it's very visible in the next quote, which is the following of the same. The Cold War tainted everything it touched. As an episode in world history, it was a tragedy of towering proportion. So its passing ought to have called for reflection, remorse, repentance, even restitution. Yet the prevailing mood allowed for none of this, at least as far as most Americans were concerned. Instead, out of an era punctuated throughout by anxiety and uncertainty, came a sense that a dazzling future lay just ahead. And of course, the crucial aspect of that quote is that it's exactly when the great acceleration, to use this expression, which is now popular, increased. The great acceleration is actually exactly after 90, and it's visible. I'm sure you know very well this sort of abacus presenting the question of a day after which we live off the planet. Of course, the calculation is very disputable. It's in French, but I decided that in McGill people in Quebec people can read the French. And you see that here, in 1980 and even in 1990, the day in which we live off the planet in depth was actually just 11th of October. So just at the time when the great acceleration even accelerated further, and now it's the 29th of July. It was moved slightly more by the COVID, but not much. And it will be, of course, lost. So it is a breakdown in the way we understand history that not only we are badly located in space, but in addition, just at the time when the question of the demise and destruction of communism could have opened the question to the realization of the ecological mutation, came a sense that a dazzling future lay just ahead. It's hard to find a period of history where people were as much misled by the moral clarity than this period, since they had won what was the expression of Reagan, the empire of evil. They believed they were good. And actually, just at the time where we were horribly bad. So you see the enormous problem raised by this difficult situation that we are constantly disoriented in space and in time. So this is where the lectures or meditation will end. I mean, are we able to understand the notion of critical zone and bring in the notion of planetary boundaries to make it possible to actually lock down or situate the whole question of abundance and liberty, to use Charbonnier's expression, inside the limit of this lockdown and inside the limit which we know very little of. Because again, the critical zone is not well known because of its heterogeneity. The fact that a few years ago we didn't know about the mass of bacteria which were actually inside the deep soil is a good example of that. So the whole question is to be able to relocate inside the planetary boundary, to use this expression of which has lots of difficulty. And in recent lectures, I will finish on that. Maybe it's not very good actually of finishing on a nightmare, but I'm locked down in Paris. You are locked down somewhere. Maybe we should share our nightmare as well. My nightmare is total production. We have been in the lockdown. We are going to get out at some point. What's going to happen? Are we going to go full scale to production, to something which is called total production? The reason why I'm so taken by this nightmare is that when I was reading Adam Tooze's The Wage of Destruction, and it's, again, I agree, it's a post-COVID nightmare, so don't take it too seriously, but this is where I am. He described, as you all know, probably, the famous talk that Goebbels gave on the 18th of February, 1943, when in a packed auditorium, he proposed, do you want total war? And he insisted, if necessary, do you want a war more total and radical than anything that we can ever yet imagine? It's 1943. We all know that the situation is going to be lost. Here you see Albert Speer, who knows perfectly well about the difficulty of the situation, and yet everybody applauds and say, yes, we want the total war. I mean, this selected set of German, of course, this is not the whole German population, but the Adam Tooze did a film on that, in which this episode is actually told, and I was very struck by that, because I was asking myself, what will happen if we actually say, not total war, but total production? We are all striving to get more after the COVID lockdown. We want to be again in this, as Bacevich said, in this extraordinary movement of infinite progress when we are actually locked down inside the small limit, unknown limit of a critical zone. Are we not sure that we will not applaud as well for total production, even though we know that it's a catastrophe? That's my nightmare. Can the process of civilization, of decivilization, the one we are actually witnessing, be interrupted? And I have no idea if it's feasible, but this is the sort of thing, nightmarish question which you ended up with if you are isolated too long into a lockdown apartment, even though it's a nice apartment in Paris. And I will finish on that by this diagram, which we try to show in an exhibition with Martin Guinard in Taipei, another exhibition where I couldn't go actually, called You and I Don't Live on the Same Planet, where we try to visualize, and there is a very nice virtual visit of this exhibition, what it means to be in a space where people now have different view of the planet itself, which is a great idea that Dipesh Chakrabarty introduced into political philosophies. And I will let you on that, knowing and apologizing for the fact that this is not a very funny and entertaining argument, but this is the sort of situation where we are locked down and we will be locked down. We are locked down and we hope to get out. The second lockdown, we should hope not to get out. And that's the difference between the two. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was terrific and stimulating and very engaging. And you've left us some time for questions and discussion. I will ask people to use the raise hand function because there are too many people to fit on one screen, so I won't be able to see you if you just gesture. And then I'll call on you in turn. But I'm going to give the closing announcements first to give Professor Latour a minute to catch his breath and his voice. We have a few announcements. One is that tomorrow morning Montreal time, Professor Latour will be back with us introducing a talk to the Lynn Center's research group on democracy, space, and technology. They will be given by Albina Yanava from the University of Manchester, titled The New Ecology of Architectural Practice, an Actor Network Theory Perspective on the Effects of COVID-19. That will be tomorrow at 9:30 Eastern Time. Registration is still available for that if you email lyncenter@mcgill.ca. For Lynn Center members, students, and faculty, there is a reading group meeting a week from today to meet and discuss Reassembling the Social by Professor Latour. If you registered for that reading group and have not received the book, please be in touch with me. And the final announcement is that when we reconvene, I hope and expect in person in the fall, the scheduled 2020 annual lecture by Professor Rana Mitter, historian at Oxford, will take place on September 23rd to reopen the Lynn Center for in-person business after we have emerged from the first of these lockdowns.
And you're optimistic.
I would not be able to go on if I could not right now convince myself that by September we'll be in person. All right, and with that we will turn to questions. Ryan Kurana.
Thank you so much for your talk, Professor Latour. I had a question for you regarding the concept of terraforming. I was reading work by Benjamin Bratton about how one of the reasons why the space of the world is getting away from us so much is because we've never had a real intentionality about what the world ought to be. And so in his view, we don't need to deep production as much as have a very intentional picture of how we're shaping the world. And I feel this kind of fits with the Gaia theory. If the world is an organism in and of itself and it's adapting to our changes, the more intentional those changes, the more they respond well to human needs. So I was wondering what your thoughts on terraforming as a human level project for the world could be.
Well, we have been terraforming it, as the example I showed of a mass of stuff equal to the Bible's mass. The question is, have we done it well? I'm not completely sure, because the habitability condition, one of them is of course the virus, have been probably not definitely, but for the human ecosystem, ways of life, probably durably threatened. So terraforming, if it's not about Mars, because terraforming on Mars is of course something else and probably even very bizarre. But there is geoengineering is part of terraforming. Lovelock is actually in some sort of way, in his latest book, proponent of a sort of ways of terraforming. But he is also the man who said that the idea that human could be a gardener of the earth is like asking a goat to be a gardener, so to speak. So, I mean, the ability of a human to, so far, to be terraforming and giving, if I understood your question, a sort of a goal, a better goal, so to speak, is of course part of a modernist dream, I would say, which is probably, again, total production. I mean, a sort of even more expansion, a green production, so to speak, so that the limit of the earth and the limit of production are actually overlapping completely. And I think this is a slightly dangerous way to handle the question, which is more, on the contrary, to try to limit. I mean, depending on what you understand as limits. But it's there's a whole eco-modernist movement about that. The eco-modernist group would agree with you. I mean, why should we not give a goal to this machinery, which is going on its own system and badly done, as we see with the climate? So it's an interesting adventure, but I think it's very modernist, the terraforming argument. It's more like, can we learn from the critical zone, which I would try to, but I see the point.
Thank you very much.
floor is open. Oscar Lima.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. It was very enlightening. Sorry if I don't turn on my camera because my internet connection is really bad, so I might be interrupted because the data connection. My question is, if you consider your thesis a dystopic thesis, because as I was understanding, when you talk about this critical layer, this critical zone, and you end up talking about there's not enough space for everybody, as I understood. For example, we live in a place that we don't know how it works, but we still have this dream of total production. So, and then you start to see governments, and I want to link a bit with your question on politics. And you see governments around the world talking eventually that there is no place for everyone. So you talk a bit about tenant politics and all this theoretical production on like Agamben and Membe and all these authors saying how people are more and more becoming exposed to dangerous situations and such things. And I would like to comment on that because I thought this was very, maybe was my interpretation, but I thought this was kind of present on your final words. Thank you again.
I had difficulty hearing, but I understand that the argument is about the extent of poverty, right?
Yes, yes. It's about how we still dreaming. Sorry, for if my microphone is not good, and how we as we don't understand where we're living.
Oh yes,
with all this bacteria and virus and stuff, and how we face this.
Yeah, this is the great interest of a book I mentioned by Charbonnier, which is to say, all of the philosophical, political questions about liberty were very nice, but they didn't very clearly say where are you allowed to be free and where you are not allowed to be free. And that's where the clash of the cantilever, the gap between the world we live in, for instance, as citizens of France, and the numbers of other entities living elsewhere who are actually making the life in this flat possible is actually now made visible in a much more accentuated way by the ecological mutation. It's a way, if you want, to add to the question of poverty and domination, the ecological question, instead of always opposing the two as if it was a choice between the two. So the great quality of the argument of Charbonnier is to make the link between these two in a much more clear way. And in the work I'm doing now, I'm doing field work now in little village in France and little city. It's very interesting to see the speed at which the intensification of those fights about soil, about poverty, we all had a great episode 2 years ago of the Gilets jaunes, is actually fusing the classical question of social classes, if you want, with other questions which are even more tense about the habitability condition. So my argument, I didn't have time to develop here, but I'm working with quite a lot of people on that in France, is how do we show the intensification of a fight, which very often, especially in agricultural question and the question of architectures and urbanism, is actually about soil. I mean, really, literally occupation of space. Don't forget the whole dispute about the Gilets jaunes 2 years ago was about a question of taxation of oil. And that's the sort of thing we if I understood the question, I think you're perfectly right about that.
Pratik Mahajan.
Thank you, Professor Latour, for your talk. I wanted to hear your thoughts about another kind of effect that COVID has had, which is not just to lock people down, but to also displace them. from their places. So I'm mostly thinking about migrant workers who live in cities, and because of COVID, economic activity was just shut down. A lot of migrant workers in India had to move from cities, walk thousands of kilometers back to their villages. So how would you conceive of your like the critical zone for the kind of people who are not just locked down from the world because of COVID, but are actually displaced in it?
Well, actually, one of the very important learning lesson of a lockdown, even in country like France, is actually about the realization of that sort of situation. So it's not only as massive as it was in India, of course, but it's visible through the whole realization that people suddenly had that they needed a lot of people to get their deliveries, so to speak. And but of course it was completely rationalized, but it was completely different and completely linked to migration and so on. So there has been, if I can say that, it's one of the aspects of a pandemic lockdown. I'm talking now. We have a question. The critical zone is about the cosmological lockdown, which is, I agree, a completely different scale. But the one very interesting one, I think, is the amount of learning that people had about class. I mean, basically, in France, Germany, Italy, England, people talk about class struggle in a way which has been accentuated and made much more visible than before, when people were sort of trying to imagine that class had disappeared, so to speak. Well, suddenly they were not disappearing at all. So that's for the pandemic part. The cosmological part, because critical zone is about cosmology. I mean, it cannot be immediately connected to political question. The way it is connected to political question is through this very interesting aspect, which I didn't have time to talk, which is that the whole geopolitics is organized around this question of temperature of the atmosphere, which is very bizarre because it's a geopolitical question which is accepted by all of the decision made by state. I mean, theoretically at least. So it is the horizon. So the lockdown is there politically, geopolitically. The lockdown is accepted. We have to stay inside these 2 degrees, whatever happens. Even though we know, my friend scientists say we will never be there. But let's hope, like Jacob Levy said, let's hope we will stay inside. And it is this sort of dome, if you want, this sort of limit which organizes geopolitics, which resonate with the sort of thing you are describing. But I agree with you that the number of steps between the geopolitics of state and what happened to the millions of people who had been put out by the pandemic are very far. But I still think, this is a topic of a book which I just published, that there is a resonance between the COVID and the new climatic regime, to use my expression. Of course, it's not the same. We should not confuse the two, but it resonates. The lockdown 1 and the lockdown 2, they give us a direction, they give a sort of general limit, yes, a sort of space inside which politics will now unfold, including the sort of terrible situation that you describe. Still, we should not confuse the effect of a pandemic and the effect of a global warming and the geopolitics of a global warming. But I think they are connected.
Connor Bean, welcome back, Connor, an alumnus of the center.
Hi, first of all, Bruno, thank you very much for the talk. It was wonderful. And also thank you, Professor Levy, for welcoming me back, virtually at least. I just had one question. I was really interested in your analogy drawn between total war and total production. And I was just kind of thinking along the lines of at least some theories of total war as this kind of suicide of the state, where it would rather push itself to the limits of perishing then give up on its object of war. And the image you presented from the Nazi example is very striking in that you had like an actual image and text from a speech showing a case where we see members of the Nazi state kind of applauding themselves and declaring their intent to push up to total war in this kind of almost declaration of intent to, kill their own state. I was just wondering, thinking along those lines, would there be any analogous agent or cluster of agents that have that same position in total production of either recognizing themselves as engaging in it or in kind of applauding their own effort to resume that? And it could be going beyond the analogy, but I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
There is no, it's a nightmare. It's just that I've been interested for the last 20 years by the mystery of climate denial. Climate, and I try to understand the root of that. And this is why I'm so interested in Bacevich quote, because this idea that you cannot learn from experience. The 20th century, I have a whole theory about the 20th century, which cannot learn from experience. The small clarity that they got out of a war, of a winning, so to speak, winning the Cold War, but misplaced moral clarity is everywhere in the 20th century. So now if we go to the present situation, I'm asking the question, again, a nightmarish question, which we ask every one of us. Maybe we are divided, every one of us. There's no actors like the state that you mentioned, the Nazi state, but we are us. We are divided. And if we ask every one of us, do you want to move on toward more production, even if it's green production, will we applaud or not? We are not prepared not to applaud. And in Touzers show that very well. In this 1943 dialogue, the choice was actually: do you want to collapse? No. Do you want to what's the word in capitulation, or do you want total war? Now let's ask ourselves if you want décroissance, degrowth, or total production. Are we sure that people will not applaud? This is my nightmare. And whatever, say, yes, let's support the states wherever they are, America, India, China, France, Canada, where people would say, yes, we know it's a very bad idea, but we move on. Are we sure that people will not applaud? This is my anxiety. You see what I mean? But I agree, the metaphor breaks down, because there is no Nazi state. It's much more diffused than that. Yet, on the misunderstanding about the situation, I think we have seen that during the whole 20th century. People misunderstanding where they were in time. And 89, of course, 1989 is the most extraordinary moment. That's precisely the moment when I wrote, "We have never been modern." Because precisely I was seeing that it was the destruction, the capitulation on both sides. Anyway, I think it's just a nightmare. Thank you for the question.
Shal Marriott.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. It brought to my mind Hannah Arendt, who, of course, had concerns about how the development of technology, and particularly like the idea of wanting to go beyond the Earth, would separate us from what it meant to be human. And so I was wondering if you might share your insights into how we use the idea of space, and particularly our space on the Earth, to develop a definition of what it means to be human and to share in a fundamentally human experience as compared to being beyond the Earth.
Well, that's very nice, because it was a slight dispute in France with a guy a sociologist who exactly said that we are no longer human if we don't go to Mars. And it's horrible to be just terrestrial or earthly This is the planetary dispute I mentioned before. I mean, there are people who think that you are human only if we go beyond the space, the limited space of a critical zone. So this is one, it's exactly like the total production nightmare. It is actually a debate inside ourselves, inside society, inside the different class, if you want, about where is our humanity. Is it by going away and still trying to break down the, for class, I was watching again The Right Stuff this afternoon, and you saw the energy and moving ahead, etc. But is it the sort of skill we need now to set inside the lockdown? That's a problem. But there is no unanimity. We are divided on that very question. We were not in the sort of modernist scenography, at least probably not in the 70s, let's say. There was the idea that the whole Earth will be modernizing itself. So the drive. But now when I hear Elon Musk say that he will go to Mars, I'm asking myself, but how many people will go with it? So is it a modernizing movement or is it an escape? And that's, I think, where the shift between modernism and escapism can be detectable. But again, we are divided because a part of me wants to go to space and another part wants to be terrestrial. I mean, this is the situation. We are divided about planetary. The planet is not unifying us as it was, so to speak, in the modernist sort of movement. But it's a very important question.
Firdaus Nazar.
Thank you, Dr. Latour, for your wonderful presentation. I really liked the way each of those ideas flowed within the other. Personally, I must confess that I'm a young researcher and I was not familiar with geography before your talk today. So when you showed us some of the slides and some of, particularly in the video where you buffered through and showed us some of the visuals of the cosmological mapping of the carbon cycles. So it seemed to me that there is a power to these visuals and these representations of these kind of really strong philosophical concepts around the human's role in this kind of terraforming or the shifting. So wondering how much power do these representations have in kind of mediating ways forward in terms of perhaps mitigating or even setting the ground for talking ways forward and beyond this kind of total production nightmare that you were referring to. So do you see these kind of representations taking center stage in these discussions or debates, and how much they influence the discussions?
Maybe not central stage, but certainly this is a very important question, this is why I spent some time with the example of a paper by Alexandra Arendt, because it's an interesting conjunction between an architect, a geochemist, and a philosopher on a prime of representation. Because my general argument, this is why I gave also some example of exhibition and theater, is that precisely because it's a cosmological shift of great magnitude, there is no other, we don't have the attitude, affect, and so we have neither the concept nor the affect, so to speak. So they have to be joined, and that's why the collaboration with artist, designer, architect for me is so important. Because if not, we will never be able to swallow the fact of being locked down forever. To have a notion of limit, what does it mean by limit, even though there is very little knowledge about it, so it's actually limit, but it's limitless. What it is to abandon progress, what it is to abandon, I mean, all of those affect and concept have to be worked simultaneously. So it's a very important question. And yes, you have to you have to do both concept and affect.
The queue is currently empty. We have 2 minutes left to go, but that makes it 2 minutes until midnight Paris time, and Professor Latour has put in a heroic hour and a half of time and effort for us. And will, as I said, be rejoining us tomorrow morning, Montreal time, to introduce Albena Yaneva's talk, about which I put information into the chat.
So what's time for me? What's time for me?
9:30 Montreal time means 15 hours 30, 3:30 p.m.
3:30. Okay, very good.
And with that, we come to the end of the 5th annual and the strangest in our physical setting, Jan P. Lynn Center annual lecture. Please join me in extending our very warm thanks to Professor Bruno Latour.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.